Hey guys, it's Olivie Blake, and this is me not writing. I'm definitely getting mask me, so just in case you are having any issues where you're looking at your face and being like, oh my god, what's happening? That is also happening to me. Yes, I'm keeping my masks clean. It's just, I think it might just be inevitable. I've kind of done some reading about it, and as far as I can tell, I've always been sort of like a skin minimalist. I think my skin is perhaps a little bit oily, and it's definitely acne prone, so I don't always wear moisturizer and stuff. I usually just put on like SPF or maybe like a facial oil. And as for what I've read, I should be using a moisturizer at basically putting more distance between my bare skin and the mask. So I don't know if that's the answer, but it's an answer. So yeah, if you're also having that problem, TBD. I'm really having an issue. I mentioned on Twitter the other day, that I've really developed like an anxiety about men. I think just because I'm really not outside very often, so all the things that used to be just part of my daily life now feel especially menacing, pun intended. So, you know, when I'm like running at 5 a.m. and some dude like yells something about my body, that's just like really not what I want, you know? And a lot of men are also not wearing masks, and they're not keeping 6 feet of distance, and so I just feel like especially endangered, which is it's an uncomfortable feeling. It used to be that like bad encounters with strange men were like, like they would happen 25% of the time, but now they're happening 100% of the time because the frequency of the time that I'm outside is less. So yeah, and I can't really do anything about that. So anyway, these are actually not so petty grievances. These are some maybe real grievances, especially with the acne thing. There's just something about like not recognizing yourself in the mirror, I think, that makes it, that lends it a little bit of it's beyond vanity, you know? So I just wanted to say that in case you needed someone to say that. So I will be posting the If I Had Your Face discussion questions today. I don't know how other people are going to feel about it because I kind of have a tendency to enjoy a dose of reality to my fiction that some people don't. So we'll see. I found actually that this book was the only thing that was getting me out of my personal slump. I read it right when this the stay-at-home orders were just starting and when the virus was just becoming a major problem. And so I was kind of dealing with my own feelings of hopelessness, especially as it comes to class, which is something we talked about when we were having our like fertility, motherhood discussion. This is something that came up. It's just like, it's hard to imagine having children in a world where it's so difficult to save because we have debts to pay, because it costs so much to live. There was just recently a report about how minimum wage no longer covers a 2-bedroom rent anywhere in America, which is crazy. It just means that no matter what, if you want to have children, you're like making major sacrifices that most people don't want to make. Even people who do want to have children can't necessarily afford it. And so to read about this from the perspective of, you know, 4 young Korean women was extremely, it was, you know, it's one of those things where it's weirdly reassuring. As much as it is about stratification of gender roles, what men can get away with and what the wealthy can get away with, which often happens to be the same thing. It's also about hope and where you find hope. And I think it was very interesting that like each of these characters had something different to live for, some more compelling than not. You know, you have Ara, who's got kind of the idol worship thing with Taeyeon, the K-pop singer. And then you have Curie, who is like, she's the filial daughter. She is living for her mother, which, you know, the irony of that is. And then you have Miho, who's living for her art in some ways, but also living for her guilt in a lot of other ways. And then Wana, who's not really living for anything at all until, you know, this thing happens to change her life. So it was really interesting to have this, what we live for, what about the future excites us, and kind of revolve that around the fundamental question of womanhood, which in a lot of ways is motherhood. And whether or not that's possible, or whether or not you want it, and how it can still change your life to know that it's happening. So hopefully you felt that that was an interesting read. just reading Curie shitting on men was like great. So hopefully you enjoyed that at least. Curie was probably my favorite character, or the one I felt was the most driving character of the book. Sujin was obviously like, it's crazy that she didn't have it. Actually, I think it was smart that Sujin didn't have a perspective, because then we were able to see her from so many different angles and how she was the driving force in so many of these girls' lives. But Miho's story was very, it's hard not to root for Miho. Anyway, let's move on. So, okay, so this is kind of a big question that has tragically a short answer. Like, I really thought this was going to be more of a discussion, but anyway, let's get into it. Hey, Olivie, so I try to use cruelty-free makeup products and I can barely afford the high-end brands that are approved since the drugstore brands like Maybelline and L'Oreal test on animals. I'm so conflicted on this, even with fast fashion, as it is a cheaper alternative. I do thrift also. I don't know, I feel like there's a wealth gap in sustainable consumerism that we don't talk about. So this was the initial ask. It kind of came apropos of nothing, but like, that's cool. It's a super good conversation. And someone followed up with, to the ask about cruelty-free makeup and fast fashion / intersectionality, I think we also don't acknowledge that fast fashion stores are often one of the biggest ways people who are plus size get clothes that are somewhat stylish and also not $60, Canadian dollars, for a plain t-shirt. Thrift store sections lack options, and what is good is often taken for a do-it-yourself project for someone 3 sizes smaller. More sustainable stores don't cater to larger sizes. Sadly, ethical consumption isn't so easy. So my degree is in urban planning. Essentially, my studies are in sociology, especially in an urban context. Like, that was my focus. And I did reach out to some of my own professors, but I didn't get a response, so I did some of my own research, and it turns out to be kind of a more open and shut than I was hoping it would be. So basically, ethical consumerism is the idea that in a system of capitalism / the free market, people make decisions that reflect their values. So in an ideal world, people vote with their dollars and they buy things that reflect their ethics, their values. So this is assuming quite a few things. One, it's assuming a world of perfect information where you know exactly how things were made, what materials they are made from, what the company stands for, and what the CEO has contributed money to, that you can compare 2 products and select one based on the fact that one was like not created with slave labor and was made with recycled materials, and there wasn't, you know, excess water, and the shipping, the carbon footprint is XYZ. So one of the main problems is that, of course, you can never have perfect information because the free market is not an honest market. So there are things you'll never know about how things are produced. And then the second point is that you also have competing values. So one of the things that I brought up is that food is a big deal because ideally, right, everybody wants to make sure their eggs are cage-free and that they're, you know, if they eat meat, that those animals are not like in a terrible, gross, like industrial farm. You know, you want the grass-fed cows and the happy cows from California and whatever. And so I think there's this idea that yes, everybody wants that. Everybody thinks of themselves as a good citizen, that they would want, if they had the choice, to choose all these things. But in reality, you can only afford to have some of those things because capitalism allows for eggs to not be cage-free. In the supermarket, you find both the very, very affordable eggs and the eggs that are expensive and also cage-free. So you're kind of you're having to make this choice. The market has made it so that you have to make a choice. What are your values? Without taking into account that you may not be able to buy based on your values. Essentially, the answer that this comes down to is that ethical consumerism does not work in the real world, which is basically the point that the initial asker was making, which is that this is a world that has privilege, and capitalism does not account for privilege. It doesn't account for the fact that you're only going to be given these choices with limited materials. You're basically given the choice, but one hand is tied behind your back, because you can't necessarily choose to buy the things that you care about because they're not available to you at a price you can afford. The overarching thesis here is capitalism and ethical consumerism cannot coexist. So the first point that I made is that with perfect information, you still can't make these choices because you're still having to choose. So This is from an article in Vogue that was interesting. So she says, I've spent 2 years rehabbing a bum knee and I'm chomping at the bit to start training again. Do I buy one brand's shoe made entirely from sea garbage but in a sweatshop in Southeast Asia? Or do I buy from a brand with no environmental commitments but it produces in a unionized factory here in the US? What if the brand that produces domestically is led by a CEO with Me Too complaints? What if there's another sneaker brand that signed a deal with Colin Kaepernick and I like Colin Kaepernick? And her point being that values compete. And yes, they definitely do. So yeah. So on the one hand, this doesn't work. Even if you have perfect information and all the money in the world, you're still, so even if you're making this decision not based on your economic level at all, it's still choosing between competing values. And there's not necessarily a product that will satisfy all those values at once. But one thing that I did not enjoy about that article, which will be linked below, so their main point was that there's a difference between the private wants of a consumer and the public ideals of a citizen. But I wrote, this article forgets about income. It doesn't even touch on the fact that you can't afford to have all those values. So then I read another article from The Guardian, which is The Dilemma of Ethical Consumption, How Much Are Your Ethics Worth to You? So this author says, there seems to be something uniquely cruel about creating a system that determines ethical seriousness by purchasing power, thereby stigmatizing the poor and lightening the load on the wealthy, which is exactly what the first asker was talking about, which is, yes, the wealthy are allowed to feel they're doing something good for the world, when in reality, their purchasing power is not, you know, that's one person's purchasing power versus the masses who aren't able to make those choices. And putting that burden on the poor is absurd. Another thing I noticed when I was doing this research is that a lot of the research on ethical consumerism comes from the UK, which I think is because the UK recently passed a Modern Slavery Act that's basically like, you can't just underpay people because of capitalism. At the heart of the ethical consumption movement, it's to tell you that it's your fault, but it's not. It's the fault of a larger system offering you choices that in many cases you simply shouldn't be permitted to make. So the point is, unfortunately, we cannot vote with our dollars. We have to vote with our actual votes because it is the government's responsibility to, this is why we would have governments, is to make sure that we have the right to, instead of, you know, like the grocery store example, instead of being presented with the option to buy unethically but cheaply, or ethically with money we don't have, that shouldn't be a thing. Everything should be produced ethically so that we are not forced to make that decision. The burden is not on the lower classes. The end of this article, which I enjoyed very much, is, I resent that by refusing to divest from unethical and harmful products, some companies are using the promise of a greater retirement fund and more money to pass on to future generations as bribes to make me compromise my morality. I can't be proud participating in a system where my ability to make ethical choices is based more on my bank balance than my character. And this is true of basically every industry. So yeah, we want to be able to make those choices when we can, to buy from companies that, you know, I try to buy from companies that are female founded. I try to go out of my way with the income that I have to buy from companies that are female founded, from recycled materials, and in that way, they're reflecting my beliefs. But that is, you know, it's very limiting. And I think this is one of the, like, basically what we have to do is to oppose the system of capitalism we're currently claiming could work, because this is not a free market, will never be a truly free market. I think that's not really something that we even want. So yeah, this has gone on for quite a while, and it will probably continue to go on because I am hoping to still get some more literature about it. But it seems to be kind of a short answer, actually, despite the length that I've taken to give an answer. Don't suffer that burden, because you shouldn't even be presented with that burden. And I think that the answer, unfortunately, is somewhere in politics. It's somewhere in the policies of what the choices we're given. These choices should be made based on us as citizens, not as purchasers. So unfortunately, this answer, like most answers, is vote and try to be active in our political system to make sure that it reflects our values. It was discouraging. It is definitely discouraging. So let's try something else. So how do you keep writing a story? I have ideas for stories, but when I start writing them, I get a couple chapters in and just hit a wall on how I want to get them from point A to point D in the plot. What are points B and C? I don't know. It happens in all my stories and it's frustrating. So this is going to be a weird example, but I don't know if you've ever seen the film Miracle. I recently, I think like many people, got Disney Plus in order to watch Hamilton. And then Mr. Blake made me watch all the Mighty Ducks movies because I've never seen them. And then we watched Miracle because I guess we were just watching hockey movies. And one of the things that I've taken from this is their coach's training plan, which is essentially to train so hard and for so long that their endurance can outlast the other teams. And this is something I've also learned in boxing. So what I'm trying to make here is that you kind of have to train, and that training is very strenuous. So how do you keep writing a story? You have to just sweat through it. Like you have to, and the reason I'm drawing this to sports for whatever reason is because it does feel like a physical strain. Like sitting there and forcing the story to come out is awful. And it does feel like I was doing intervals yesterday and I had to ask my coach if I was crying or sweating because I like could not tell the difference. And that's the thing, is when you're in this process of, yeah, you keep running into this problem because you haven't trained hard enough, because you haven't finished enough stories, you haven't taken enough stories from A to D. And I know it, like, I'm sure you want there to be a better answer, like, and there probably is like a possible answer per story. You know, if it's a matter of a writer's block, you could, you know, you go for a walk or you get a change of scenery, you work on something different until something comes to you. But I think that the more important truth is you have to push through this, and it's going to hurt and you're going to sweat and it's going to be awful. But the next time you will not run into this problem where you're like fatigued too soon. So ways to do this. I don't know if this is fan fiction or not, because with fan fiction, I operate under the assumption that everyone is posting as they write, which is how I do things. I write a chapter, I post it. And I run into this problem, same as you do, and I used to run into it more frequently, which is that I don't know what I want to happen to get to the end, so I just kind of write something, anything. I just try to do something that I think is going to take me to where I want to go. I make it make as much sense as I possibly can, and I just keep moving. And this does not feel good, I can assure you. I've been here where it's like, I'm not really sure that I've done the right thing here. I don't know if this is the best plot point. I hate this. There have been definitely times when I've posted a chapter and just straight up hated it, but needed to work through it, because you cannot end a story unless you work through it. You kind of have to always operate with the assumption that there is a perfect story that exists in you. And each time you write a story, you get closer and closer to that perfect story. Will it be this story? Maybe not. Will it be the next story? Possibly not. But the more you write, the closer you get to it. And that is the miracle training plan. Why am I making so many sports analogies? But that is the miracle plan, which is that you are training for that perfect game. The truth is that you never get the perfect story. That doesn't happen. The perfect story doesn't exist. You can always make things better, but you'll feel more like you're getting there each time. Writing is in some ways about endurance. You have to, especially if you're writing a novel or a long fan fiction or whatever, you have to train for it. It doesn't just happen. You have to have done it several times in order to do it in a way that is maybe as pleasing to you as you want it to be. And that doesn't mean that other people aren't going to find it good in the meantime. Just because points B and C they're not the points you wanted to make, doesn't mean that other people aren't still going to value it. I don't think that Clean and Marked are as good as they could be. That's not relevant. It just, what I provided to some people is what they wanted. So even if I feel like every story that came after it is better in some way, that's kind of how you're supposed to feel. You're supposed to feel like you just keep getting better, not that you create the perfect story and then stop. But you do have to practice endings. This is something I've said before too. You have to practice over and over, and you have to think of it as if you're training for a marathon, or as if you're training to play the Soviet Union in the 1980 Olympics. That has to be your outlook on it, is that maybe it feels uncomfortable to try to work through these points and trying to work through this period where you're like, I don't really know how I'm going to get there. you have to build up the muscles that allow you to practice thinking ahead, or to finding the ways. You know, there is a little bit of magic in writing. There are lots of times when I write something and I don't know where I'm going with it, and then it turns out that like I accidentally laid the foundation for the right ending, and sometimes I don't even notice. Yeah, you get better at it the more you do it, which I know maybe doesn't feel helpful right now, but that's why I say it's about endurance. It will be helpful to you every time after this. It will be more and more helpful. You will have built up the stamina to keep going and to find the right ending and to reach it the right way, or what feels right to you. Keep going. How do you characterize your OCs? So original characters in a fan fiction. I've been told that my main OC usually comes off dry or not fleshed out very well, and I'm at a loss. Any help would be very much appreciated. So first thing is nobody's ever going to like an OC. They just never are. People are coming to fan fiction for not only for something similar to canon, they're coming to something that's built out of fandom. So even characters like Theo Knott or Daphne Greengrass that are not in the books, they still have, they're accepted by fandom because they are fandom built. They have certain personalities that come out of this collective imagination. You know, everyone knows Daphne Greengrass is a beautiful character. We don't know why we came up with that, but we collectively believe it. Fandom imagination. That's what makes fan fiction really cool, is that it is it's born from a collective, and not very often out of canon, which can be frustrating at times too when you look at how Hermione and Draco are sometimes characterized. That's not important. So just as a heads up, most OCs are used badly, I think. Like, most of them are in the story to be positioned as a rival, usually a romantic rival, because most times people want a character that the audience is not going to get attached to because they know what the ultimate pairing is going to be. They have some expectation of what it's going to be. The role of an OC, I think most people, when they see an original character, they kind of assume that this character is not going to be important, or they just initially, in the same way that we all expect Daphne to be one particular character, we all assume that the OC in a story is a threat to the romantic pairing that we want. Even incorrectly. This is something that happened to me a lot when I was writing How to Win Friends and Influence People, which involves a lot of original characters, because it takes place post-canon and a lot of the characters are dead, and I had to make up new ones. A lot of people hated Daisy Carnegie for unknown reasons to me. They just hated her. I don't know if they thought she was going to be like a romantic rival or something. People were like, I don't know, I just don't trust her. Like, okay. People really hated Reese Hawkworth. People hated every single OC except for Hortense and Thibaut, which they're basically only there for comic relief. They are, to my fanfiction, what Luna Lovegood is to canon. They're there to break the fourth wall, to point out things that are absurd, to just be absurd, to be a moment of levity in a tense scene. Sometimes it's not about how dynamic you make an OC. It's like, I made Daisy and Reese as dynamic as I possibly could, and they were just despised regardless. However, people did like Mel, who was there she's there as Ron's girlfriend, and nobody likes Ron in fanfiction. So it's probably not about how you crafted the character and more about the role that you put them in. If they're supposed to be important to the like OTP of the story, then people are probably just going to naturally not like them. Sometimes it's a plot choice where you need someone to be the vehicle for a plot that can't be a canon character, and therefore you have to use an OC. Sometimes it's boredom because you've just been playing with the same characters for so long and you want to write one that's your own. In that case, I always would lead you towards original work, because people are not coming to fanfiction for your imagination. They're coming to fanfiction for your version of fandom's imagination. So you are limited in some ways. So if you want to talk about characterization in general, we can do that. I personally think in fanfiction that there's just not a lot of ways you can win someone over with an OC. And it really may not have anything to do with how people are reading it so much as what they are filling in for themselves. Because again, so much of fan fiction is people filling in the blanks with their preconceived notions. And if you want people to not have preconceived notions, you have to write original fiction. which is more strenuous. I'm talking a lot about strenuous, strain, just the sweat of creating and consuming fiction. But yeah, it is, people are coming to fan fiction so that they can just let their biases, good and bad, populate the characterization versus what you're giving them. So if you're giving them something and they don't have a way to populate it, it's automatically harder. Well, anyway, I've gone on for long enough. I'm going to get back to the S.P.E.L.L. discussion post, and I am currently working on the Which Way anthology with some of the stories I've written over the years, and let me tell you, 2018 was a really questionable year for my writing. Lots of overwriting, lots of like too flowery things that are getting cut. So anyway, writing always changes, and we just keep going, even though it's exhausting. So anyway, this has been me, Olivie Blake, not writing, and I'll see you next week.